You walk into a modern gym, hear the metallic clank of plates, see a refrigerator full of protein drinks, and on the wall there he is again, the Roman gladiator. Bronze skin, veins, eight-pack. The kind of body that looks like it survives on steak, eggs, and the tears of weaker men. Movies taught us that the most feared fighters of the ancient world must have been built like luxury action figures. More meat, more muscle, less body fat. Simple, clean, cinematic, and almost completely wrong. If a real champion from a Roman arena walked through that gym door, a lot of modern people would not call him cut. They might call him thick. Some might even call him soft, not because he was weak, but because he lived in a world where looking sharp was far less important than not dying from a blade that slipped a little too deep. That is the first myth we need to kill. The gladiator was not a fitness influencer in sandals. He was a highly managed combat athlete in a violent entertainment industry. His body was not designed for a beach photo. It was engineered for punishment. Ancient writers even had a nickname for gladiators that points us in the right direction. They were sometimes called Barley Men. Not bull men, not beef men. Barley Men. That sounds underwhelming until you remember what their actual job was. They were expected to train hard, absorb impact, recover from repeated injuries, and step into an arena where a superficial cut could be the difference between applause and a funeral. Hollywood sells you a fantasy of pure predator energy. Reality gives you a feeding strategy built on logistics, pain management, and cold arithmetic. In the Roman world, meat was expensive. Cattle were valuable alive, pulling plows and carts. Fresh flesh spoiled quickly. Refrigeration did not exist. A gladiator school could not feed dozens or hundreds of fighters on heroic servings of beef every day unless someone wanted to burn money like lamp oil. Grain, on the other hand, was the empire in edible form. It stored well. It traveled well. It could feed large groups cheaply. Beans added protein, fiber, and minerals. Barley added dense, dependable calories. In other words, the food of real gladiators was not glamorous. It was scalable. Now imagine the daily life inside a gladiator school. Before the crowd, before the blood, before the cinematic slow motion, there was routine. Hours of drilling footwork, repeated strikes against wooden posts, shield work until the shoulder burned, falls, bruises, heat, dust, minor cuts, major exhaustion. These men were not doing a few dramatic rounds and then posing for a sculptor. They were professional trainees, and training eats energy. Not just a little, a lot. When you push the body hard day after day, what matters first is not the romance of protein mythology. What matters is whether the muscles can refill their energy stores and whether the fighter can do it all again tomorrow. That is where barley starts to look less like peasant food and more like sports technology. Hard training runs on glycogen, the stored form of carbohydrate kept in muscles and liver. When those stores drop, performance drops, power drops, recovery slows. Anyone who has hit a wall in endurance training has felt a tiny version of this. Roman gladiators needed fuel they could use in volume. Porridge, coarse bread, bean mash, stews thick enough to sit in the stomach and steady enough to last through long work. Not sexy, not fashionable, but brutally effective. A man can build muscle on a plant-heavy diet if the total calories are high enough, the training stimulus is severe enough, and the food arrives day after day without fail. Ancient gladiators had all three. And then we get to the detail that really offends modern mirror culture. Some experts think gladiators often maintained a layer of subcutaneous fat that offered practical advantages. Not obesity, not helpless softness, protective padding. A few extra millimeters of tissue can matter when sharp metal is involved. Deep cuts are dangerous because they reach major vessels, nerves, or organs. A more cushioned body does not make you invincible, but it can change how a wound behaves. It can help turn a potentially lethal slice into a dramatic but more survivable one. And in the arena, dramatic mattered. Spectacle was the business model. Blood thrilled the crowd. Immediate disembowelment ended the show and wasted an expensive fighter. So the ideal gladiator body was not necessarily the modern bodybuilding ideal. It was a compromise between strength, endurance, recoverability, and controlled damage. Think less statue from a supplement ad and more human armor. The Romans were not rewarding visible abs. They were managing assets. A trained fighter represented investment. He had been purchased, housed, fed, drilled, and medically maintained. If he died too quickly, the owner lost value. If he survived longer and performed well, the school profited. Suddenly, that bowl of barley looks very different. It was not what you fed a second-rate warrior. It was what you fed a valuable one. This is where the evidence gets especially satisfying, because archaeology has shown up to ruin the movie poster. One of the strongest clues comes from gladiator remains found at Ephesus, a major Roman city in what is now Turkey. Researchers studied the chemistry of the bones, using isotope analysis to reconstruct dietary patterns. That sounds technical, but the idea is straightforward. Different foods leave different chemical signatures in the body over time. If someone eats large amounts of animal protein, that pattern often looks different from someone whose calories come mostly from plants. The Ephesus gladiators did not come out looking like men raised on endless red meat. Their bones pointed toward a diet dominated by plants. Even more interesting, those same remains showed unusual mineral patterns that suggest gladiators may have consumed a drink made with plant ash. Yes, ash. The kind of detail Hollywood usually avoids because nobody looks heroic sipping what sounds like a fireplace accident. But from a physiological standpoint, it makes sense. Ash can contain calcium and other minerals. Ancient authors mention fighters drinking restorative mixtures after training. Think of it as a rough Roman recovery supplement. No shiny tub, no branding, just chemistry with worse marketing. In a world of repeated impacts and bone stress, mineral intake matters. Recovery matters. The body of a fighter is built not only in training, but in what happens after the training stops. Ancient medical writers also support the picture. Galen, the famous physician who had direct experience treating gladiators, wrote about their diets and bodies in ways that do not fit the modern fantasy. He observed the practical relationship between food, flesh, and wound behavior. He was not writing fan fiction. He was dealing with real injured men whose bodies had to survive trauma. When a doctor working with gladiators pays attention to how body composition affects injuries, that is a clue worth listening to. Now, to be clear, this does not mean every gladiator across the empire ate the exact same menu every day, or that no fighter ever touched meat. The Roman world was huge. Local supply changed everything. Some would have had access to more animal products than others. There may have been variation by class, school, region, and time period, but the core pattern matters. The glamorous meat mountain of modern imagination is not what the strongest evidence points to. The center of gravity was grain and legumes, cheap fuel, reliable fuel, institutional fuel. And if that feels disappointing, it only feels that way because modern culture confuses aesthetics with function. We have been taught to see the body as a billboard. The Romans, at least in this case, often treated it as equipment. The gladiator body had to do a job under horrifying conditions. One infected wound could kill you slowly. One broken recovery cycle could end your career. 1 week of poor feeding could reduce your sharpness in training. So the diet was built backward from the threat. First solve calories, then solve storage, then solve cost, then solve recovery, then let vanity wait outside. There is a bigger human story hiding inside this bowl of barley. We love to imagine the past as a parade of heroic individuals powered by grit alone. But survival has always been collective and technical. Somebody had to grow the grain. Somebody had to transport it. Somebody had to cook it. Somebody had to notice which foods kept fighters upright longer. Somebody had to connect bruising, bleeding, and body composition. Civilization often advances not through one glorious invention, but through 1,000 acts of unglamorous optimization. The gladiator diet is one of those optimizations. It is not romantic. It is smart. It also exposes a very old lie that still rules modern fitness culture. The lie is that visible leanness automatically equals superior performance. Sometimes it does. Often it does not. Marathoners, wrestlers, rowers, laborers, soldiers, and fighters across history have needed very different bodies for very different demands. Context decides everything. A body built to impress a camera is not the same as a body built to survive repeated trauma in an arena full of sand, metal, and bacteria. Ancient Rome understood that in the most brutal way possible. So the next time you see a polished cinematic gladiator tearing into a giant slab of meat, remember the quieter truth. The real machine of the arena probably sat down to barley, beans, and maybe an ash-based recovery drink that tasted like regret. He ate for output, for resilience, for the economics of the school, and for the chance that the next blade would cut shallow instead of deep. He was not trying to look dangerous. He was trying to remain alive, profitable, and ready for the next fight. And that is what makes the story so fascinating. Once again, the ancient world turns out to be less glamorous than the myth and far more intelligent. The gladiator did not need a modern nutrition slogan. He needed calories that stored well, carbohydrates that refueled training, legumes that stretched the ration, and enough flesh on his frame to make death work a little harder. That is not a failure of athleticism. That is athleticism stripped down to its most unforgiving purpose. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If you knew you had to enter the arena in a month, would you still choose the body built for the mirror? Or would you choose the one built from porridge, bruises, and a layer of survival just under the skin? And which truth shocked you more? That the most feared fighters in Rome were fueled by barley? Or that being a little less shredded might have been one of the smartest decisions a warrior could make?